Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to be talking about 180 degree shutter angle, what it is and why you might not want to use it. So what is 180 degree shutter? Well, it comes from a term which stems from the early film cameras, the early movie cameras, where the shutter would literally be a metal disc that was between the lens and the film, and in that metal disc there would be a slot cut, and as the disc rotated between the lens and the film, it would obviously expose the film because the light could pass through. And then when the part of the disc that moved between them became blocked, at that point, no more light was hitting the film. And so the film would be advanced up to the next frame and then ready to be exposed again. And obviously, whenever the slot came around again, it started letting the light through. So 180 degree shutter is basically half of the disc is open and half of the disc is shut. And that became a common choice and what we really became used to as viewers. So just before Christmas, I posted a couple of polls on my YouTube channel on the community tab. And that was, how strict are people with using 180 degree shutter? Now, probably 50%, I think it was 55% of people said that they always use 180 degree shutter. I think there was 35% of people that said they'll use it most of the time. A couple of weeks later, I posted another poll saying, if you're shooting 60p for use on a 30p timeline and you plan to use that footage both for slow motion, so half speed, and for normal speed, then what do you set your shutter angle to? And interestingly, I had 88% of people said that they would use 180 degree shutter. Now, one thing that I find really interesting about that is if you shoot with 180 degree shutter at 60p, say you're filming an event and you want to be able to slow the footage down or play it back normal speed. And if you play it back normal speed, the footage playback will be the equivalent of shooting with a 90 degree shutter because each frame is exposed for 1/120th of a second, so only quarter of the available time. And as such, the movement won't look that fluid. And I find it quite interesting how people are so adamant about sticking to 180 degree shutter when shooting 25p. But whenever switching to 60p, they keep it at 180 degree shutter. Now there are reasons for that, and if you are purely shooting for slow motion, then 180 degree shutter might be the right choice. But I've put together a quick test here using a food mixer because it's got some continuous motion in it, along with my motorized slider. And I'll show you exactly how choosing 180 degree shutter can affect your results when shooting in 50 or 60p. Okay, so this first example is a 25p clip where I shot with 180 degree shutter. Now this is, as I say, the standard way to use shutter angle, and you'll see here that the motion looks fluid, it looks smooth, and this is kind of what we expect when shooting with 180 degree shutter at 25p or 24p or 30p depending on where you are in the world. So now let's see what happens if we change that up to a 90 degree shutter angle. So in this version, to me, I can see that the area where the head is rotating around on the mixer, it looks kind of jumpy. Only fractionally, just doesn't really look as smooth. And if I freeze frame here and compare that to the previous clip, you can see why. So because we're now shooting with a 90 degree shutter angle instead of 180 degree, we've got half the amount of motion blur, which results in the playback not looking quite as smooth. Okay, so what about if you want to shoot 50p or 60p? Why wouldn't you want to use 180 degree shutter for that as well? Most people I speak to and the people on the poll said that if they were, say, shooting at 60p, they would set the shutter at 120. I'm using 50p here, so I'm going to set my shutter at 100 and then we'll look at the results. So in this first example, I've taken that clip and I've slowed it down by 50%, so we've got some slow-mo. Now, that is when 180 degree shutter angle is perfect, and you'll see here that it's playing back at half speed. Because there's half as much movement in the parts of the mixer, there's half as much motion blur, and that makes perfect sense. So if you're shooting at 50p for playback in half speed, that's the correct way to do it. But what about if you're on a production and some of your clips need to be played back at normal speed? Well, let's try that now using the same clip. So in this version, the clip's being played back at normal speed. And you'll see once again now it's starting to look a bit juddery. Not too bad, but very similar to the version that we shot 25-100. Now, if I put them side by side, if I match the clips together with the shot that we did at 25p with 1/100th of a second, you'll see that they're the same. And that's perfectly logical because the camera is only exposing each frame for 1/100th of a second. By changing 50 frames a second as it was shot to 25 frames a second on my timeline, all that's basically happening is that half the frames are being dropped. So we end up with a bunch of frames which are 25 frames a second with 1/100th of a second shutter speed. So no longer is our footage at a 180-degree shutter angle. It now is 90-degree shutter angle. So what I do if I'm shooting in 50p, or somebody that shoots 60p would be the same, is I use a 360-degree shutter. Now this is really only true if you're shooting something like an event or doing documentary work where you want to film everything with the same settings on the camera, but then you want to be able to choose between slow motion, half speed, or normal speed playback when you're editing. So I'll show you another test here. This clip was shot exactly the same motion, but instead of using a 180-degree shutter, I've used a 360-degree shutter. So this clip was shot at 50p with 1/50th of a second. So you'll notice that if I play this back at normal speed now, so not slow-mo, it looks more fluid because basically with half the frames dropped, the resulting footage is the equivalent of a 180-degree shutter, even though I shot at 360-degree shutter. And that's because each frame is exposed for 1/50th of a second, which is the same as if you're shooting 25p with a 180-degree shutter. Now, I hope this makes sense, but you can see if I freeze the frame on this clip and compare it to our 25p 180-degree clip at the beginning, you'll notice that there's the same amount of motion blur. Now, you might think the downside to this is that what happens if you want to slow it down? Then we won't have a 180-degree shutter. We will be showing the full 360 degrees. So let's have a look. So you'll see as the clip's playing back that even though we've got a 360-degree shutter with this half-speed clip, it still looks smooth. It still looks good. Yes, there's more motion blur, but because it's in slow motion, to me, I don't really notice any difference. And that is why I prefer to use a 360-degree shutter when shooting at 50p. If having the correct amount of motion blur, i.e. having the correct shutter angle set is important to you, then you might want to consider this and do some tests. You know, go out and shoot 50p, 60p, try 180-degree shutter, so 50 at 100 or 60 at 120, and then try the 360 shutter, so do 50 at 50 or 60 at 60, and then compare the results. And I think you'll probably find something similar to what I'm seeing here. And it's certainly something that served me well. I've done loads of events for people like Harley Davidson, where it's been great to be able to just use 60p or 50p and be able to then choose in post whether I'm going to use slow motion or normal speed and know that my normal speed footage is still going to look correct. So I hope that was useful. If you have any questions, leave a comment below and look out for some more videos coming soon. I've got some really nice new kit just turned up today actually, which I'm going to do a review of next week. And I look forward to seeing you then. Bye-bye.